Thank you for joining the McCain Institute's Authors and Insights Book Talk series, a series of discussions with authors of important newly released books on politics, policy, and leadership. My husband fought his whole life to promote character-driven leadership, and it's vitally important today to carry that legacy forward by any means necessary. Today's installment will feature Tara Kangarloo, award-winning journalist, author, humanitarian, and former alumna of the McCain Institute's Next Generation Leaders program. She will be talking about her new book, The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People, with White House correspondent for Gray Television and McCain Institute's media fellow, John Decker. This conversation will take us through the delicate balance of cultural, political, and religious settings that make up everyday life in Iran. Thank you, Tara, for joining us, and we hope everyone enjoys what will be a very insightful conversation.
Hi there, Tara. How are you?
Hi, thanks so much, John. And thank you to Mrs. McCain for that very kind introduction.
Yes, thank you to Cindy McCain, absolutely. And thank you to the McCain Institute for having this great program and having a program in which we can learn more about Tara's book. And Tara, let me start off by asking you a little bit about your background, which led you to write this book.
Absolutely, John. And of course, I want to thank the audience who are joining us for this conversation. It's always great to share the book and insights about Iran, with my fellow Americans. John, you asked about, my background. As you know, I was born and raised in Iran until I was about 16, 17. And then I moved to the States to finish high school and go to college. And, I was born an American citizen. My parents were in the US in the late 60s, early 70s, before the revolution. And so, in a way, I was always an Iranian and an American, but I didn't realize this duality of my identity before moving to the States, because I was constantly confronted with questions about where I came from, whether or not I grew up wearing, the long black veil, or, why did I look like this? Why did I not have an accent? Why did I, and all these whys and stereotypes as essentially Iranians are defined by. So, this always stayed with me. And, when I went to J school, I always found myself so drawn into telling human stories of people from different parts of the world that are not necessarily known to our American readers and our sort of Western audience. And I continued to cover the Middle East and Iran, and that really led me to write this book, because I just thought that I have the opportunity to connect these two societies who, for various reasons, haven't had relations for the last 40 years to one another, through the stories of real Iranians, through the stories of everyday people, just the way I was misunderstood or I had to explain my identity. I thought, let me tell human stories that hopefully would help dismantle some of these stereotypes and put a more human face to Iranians.
Well, that's right. For most Americans, we have very little knowledge about what is happening on a daily basis inside Iran. We get our information from sometimes second sources. It's very rare that we get, sort of the viewpoint that you provide to us about what life is like inside Iran on a daily basis. You spoke to dozens of individuals, and in your book, which I very much enjoyed reading, you provide a little glimpse in terms of what life is like for them, how they feel about America, how they feel about the connection to the United States. And often in reading these stories, there is a connection that some of these individuals have to America. They may have a son or daughter living in the United States. How did you, I'm curious, come upon finding these individuals that you've profiled?
Absolutely, John. I always say Iran is a country made up of 80 million human beings, not 80 million centrifuges or nuclear heads. And I think that's a narrative that we're missing in mainstream media and in the United States. And again, having been born in that country, but also, living most of my adult life in the US, I know for a fact that there's so much more that we have in common between Iranians and Americans than what we know or that we're told. And quite frankly, if we get to see them and hear them and know of these similarities, I do believe that so many issues can be resolved. And I quite frankly, having worked in the Middle East, I do believe that's true with any nation. I think so much of the fears that exist ensue because of the lack of knowledge and lack of understanding. And I think fundamentally it's the people of a nation who make up a country, and their stories are worth sharing. And as far as the people in the book, like you mentioned, I profiled 24 individuals in the book. However, I have to say, John, that I interviewed close to 40 people. I mean, this book took about 4 years to complete. And we had to cut it down for length purposes and so on. So 24 people are featured in the book. And the process really was, I wouldn't say it was complex. It was very straightforward in the sense that I knew the topics that I want to talk about. I knew the areas that I want to tackle, whether that be the economy, social issues, culture, arts, music, women's issues, sports, the impact of sanctions, again, economy, the medical industry, and so on. These were the topics that I wanted to cover, topics that, again, we don't often hear about in depth on mainstream. And when I sort of nailed down the topics, I then went after the people who best encapsulated and encompassed these elements, right? And you read the book, so each story is not just about one person, John. It's Iran within Iran within Iran. So, with the story of, let's say, a saffron farmer, you don't only get to hear about his very intimate and personal story, but you rather understand, the impact of sanctions on Iran's economy, the sort of black market that exists in Iran, inflation, the labor, the challenges that affect people in farming and labor, but also you understand the issues pertaining environment, family values, and really sort of a rich history that this man is keeping. So every story really unpacks layers, and there's been so much thought that has went through, in this process. So it wasn't easy. I mean, it took 4 years, like I said. There was enormous research that I put in the book, but really each person opens up a whole wide window into layers and layers of nuance that, again, perhaps folks in the West don't really see.
How did those individuals that you spoke to view you? Given the fact that you are a part of their world in terms of your background, but you're an American citizen, were they reluctant to speak with you, or did you feel there was a reluctance to be honest and open with you?
That's a great question, and I'm so fortunate and lucky and quite humbled, John, to still be connected to my country of birth. I always say I'm as Iranian as I'm American. And, people in the US, maybe if I speak with you, not knowing that I'm Iranian, maybe you never know immediately, or vice versa. But I always kept my roots in that country. And again, that's part of the reason I did this book, because in the introduction of The Heartbeat of Iran, I talk about this. I often felt like a child of a divorced parent. I love both countries. I have so much in common with both of them, but for reasons they just don't see eye to eye. So how can I keep this bridge? How can I keep this bond? And so the people who I spoke with, I have to say, were so open and were so keen on sharing their stories with their American counterparts. And I was so honest with them. I mean, they knew this book is going to be published in the US. My publishers are, New Yorkers, and, this book is for Americans. And so they actually were excited. They wanted to have their human stories shared. I mean, this is not a political book. It talks about politics. I unpack it sort of from a journalistic perspective, but these are human stories. And so for them, not having the opportunity to share their story and have their story often be told by their government or political narratives, they were keen, they were excited. But John, I have to say that, again, in the book, because the purpose is to really give a diverse image of Iran, or at least I hope, I wanted to bring a conservative voice, because those are the folks that, I mean, they live in Iran, apparently 18 million of them, because they're the ones who voted last Friday. And so I thought it's worth, again, as a reporter, to have that voice in the book. These die-hard revolutionaries who support the regime, what do they think? What do they have to say? But I have to say, they were the ones who were reluctant and didn't want to talk to me. So, I'm sad that I couldn't add this voice, because they exist in the country, and I think it's worth highlighting that story as well. But they're the ones that were reluctant in speaking with me.
Is there, from what you could tell, a commonality that exists among the people that you interviewed for the book? Is there sort of a thread that runs through these Iranians who live life the way we live life, but to a large extent, we don't know what their lives are like on a regular basis. We get a window through your book in terms of what life is like for them, what life has been like for them, both before and after the revolution. But did you find there was a common thread that sort of binds them all together in some way?
That's a great question. And I think that common thread that I found is so universal, John. Almost all these people, categorically, again, they come from different lives. We have the rich, the poor, the left, the right, from north to south. We can talk about the characters a little bit, but they're so diverse and so different from one another. But yet they truly share this aspiration for living a prosperous, happy, free life. And I think those are universal values that we in the United States, or elsewhere in the world, aspire to and share. And I think what differentiates perhaps some of these stories and these people from others around the world is that despite all the challenges, socially, economically, politically, they have found ways to live. They have found ways to get by, and to, in many cases, thrive, again, despite all the challenges. And I think those journeys are what inspired me, after each interview, or after finishing each story, is that despite how dark and confined life can be for some of these people, they are still living life, and they're dreaming and hoping and pushing forward. And there's an enormous amount of resilience and zeal in the vibrant society and the talented society that exists in Iran, that if only policymakers and folks in the US would recognize that and see the potential that these people have, I think that would be for the benefit of not that country, the region, but the world at large.
Is there an awareness, based upon your conversations, Tara, of how the rest of the world views Iran, how the rest of the world views the leadership of Iran, how the country is viewed in the United States by regular folks, as well as by politicians, the people that represent the electorate?
Absolutely. John, I was in Iran in 2015 with Al Jazeera America covering the nuclear talks. And I actually did a piece on this, interviewing ordinary Iranians on their view of America and, their American counterparts. And I have to say, again, categorically, Iranians, everyday Iranians, I'm talking about, ordinary folks, ordinary people, they love Americans. They want to connect with the United States. They want to connect with their American counterparts, but they understand that, for obvious reasons, they can't. And I think what differentiates at times the Iranian view versus, that of the US is that the people in Iran are aware that the policies of the United States, the policies of the US government is different than the people's view and ordinary people. They can differentiate the two. And I think so much of that is because they themselves separate their views from that of the government. The Iranian government is one singular insular view, and people inside the country don't necessarily find anything in common with that view, and quite frankly have a very big difference of opinion, and therefore want to have that opinion shared with the rest of the world, which again they don't often get to, but they can very easily distinguish between a government and its people, and that's really my intention again with the book, for my American readers and audience to be able to distinguish that, the rhetorics and the narratives that you see come out of Iran on mainstream is that of the government most of the time, not of the people. And so these are some of the voices and stories of the people. And unfortunately, I do believe that, again, in the United States in the last 40 years, the narrative on Iran has been so dominated by the nuclear talks and politics, and a president that 90% of people can't even pronounce his name. And so it's time to introduce alternative and human narratives when talking about Iran, because the history of this country does not start at 1979. It starts long before, and there's so much history, culture, heritage embedded in this nation. And it's worth understanding those and being able to differentiate between the government and the people.
You write in your book, Tara, how it's pretty common to see satellite dishes throughout, obviously, a place like Tehran, for instance. People, it seems, the citizenry of Iran wants to get a sense about what's happening in the outside world. What are they learning? And are, for the sake of the people watching our conversation, to what extent is there censorship that exists right now in Iran to prevent everyday Iranians from seeing what's happening outside their country?
Oh, they see everything. They see everything. They're connected. I mean, as censored as everything is, I mean, Iranian kids, especially the young people, they're so savvy. They're VPNs and ways to go about, whatever filtering that exists. And John, I was so surprised to see so much debate happening on Clubhouse. I don't know how familiar you are with Clubhouse, but I've been tapping into it the last couple of months. But even government insiders, not candidates for the presidency, were on Clubhouse hosting conversations with people in Iran, but also expats and opposition voices from the US or UK coming in, and I found that so fascinating. I mean, you have government officials and political figures on Twitter, Instagram, and again, mind you that these platforms are banned in Iran, but it's used, it's the filters are broken, satellite dishes. When I was a kid in Iran, in early 90s, well, I guess satellite dishes came later on, late 90s, but mid 90s. It was much more strict. It was much more strict back then, right? You literally would have police come in, knock on your door, and we had to pack the satellite, and it was just this, big drama. But gradually, it sort of became a way for the government to make money off of this. You just bribe people, and you bribe the police officers. And I mean, everybody has satellites. Everybody, even government officials have satellites. So with the same with everything else. Alcohol is the same. It's banned. But Iranians actually are the highest consumers of alcohol in the Middle East. That was one of my research in, for the book. In Kuwait, I was in Kuwait. Getting alcohol in Kuwait is harder than getting alcohol in Iran. And so there's a way that Iranian people, this 80 million nation, have found to maneuver these hard lines, these confinements and censorships. And I think there's so much to say about their savviness and ambition for belonging to the international community in this maneuvering of life. And yeah.
What does that look like? If in speaking to the people that you spoke with, Tara, what does becoming a part of the international community look like from their perspective? What do they see the role of Iran in the region and the role of Iran in the world?
Absolutely. I think, regionally speaking, the people are quite fed up with the government's stance on issues, regionally. They constantly say that, their government is responsible for their well-being, for spending Iran's money on the people rather than spending it in, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. So they're quite frankly fed up with that. So they understand that position, and that has been a frustrating issue for them for years. But for their role, I think so much of it trickles down to economy, and so much of it comes down to finances. And Iran's economy is at a breaking point. I mean, things have gotten so bad in the last 4 years because of the maximum pressure campaign from the previous administration, which quite frankly hasn't weakened the government. It has only emboldened the hardliners and the conservatives, which we now see the result of. It has sidelined all the sort of reformist and moderate voices. It has collapsed the economy that has only affected the ordinary people, ordinary citizens. And so I think young Iranians want to commercially belong to the rest of the world. They want to be able to do business. The country is made up of an enormously young, talented, educated society. And for them, prosperity means job opportunities, growth, entrepreneurship. Iran has an enormous amount of opportunity to diversify from its oil and gas-based economy. But again, it can't, because it's not connected and plugged into international markets. And so much of that has to do with sanctions. So fundamentally, again, just to sort of wrap it up, that thought, they're tired of their government, misbehaving in the region. They see no use of that, but they can't do much about it. So, instead, they like to find ways to commercially connect to the rest of the world, to perhaps find ways to, economically improve their own conditions.
Is there a full understanding, based upon your conversations, as to why Iran is viewed as a pariah nation in much of the Western world? Do they understand why these sanctions have been placed upon the country? Do they understand why it's not just the last administration, but it seems successive administrations, regardless of party, have viewed Iran as this pariah nation?
Oh, absolutely. I think Iranians, again, ordinary Iranian people are very well aware of the behavior of their government, and they're very well aware of why those behaviors lead to certain responses. However, they don't necessarily agree with the sanctions. The sanction conversation is such a long conversation. We can talk about it happily, but there's so many things that can be done differently to not hurt ordinary Iranians that is not being done. And Iranian people understand that. And quite frankly, the relationship between the US and Iran, and Europe and Iran, that being France, Germany, and UK, has been a long relationship. Iranians still remember the 1953 coup that was orchestrated by the US and UK. That's still in the memory. Iranians still remember the 8-year-long Iraq war. Again, Saddam got support from the US in various ways. And so people in Iran remember that. But then again, they are able to distinguish between the governments and the people around the world. But absolutely, that's why Iran, in ways, despite sanctions, I was there, back in 2015, I did a piece on the country's automotive industry, which is actually quite interesting, because automotive is a heavily sanctioned sector in Iran. And in that 8-year period under Ahmadinejad, the first few years was awful, but then somehow these people managed to be self-reliant, and they started building pieces at home versus importing. So in ways it has created this entrepreneurial attitude, but again, that only impacts a very small percentage of the population. And John, I want to also add one thing, that in the absence of relations with the US, the economy of Iran would be infiltrated by Russians and the Chinese, as seen right now. So, in all of this, Iranian people find themselves so helpless, but still they find ways to push forward.
During the administration of President Obama, of course, there was this discussion that ultimately culminated in the Iran nuclear deal involving the US and other Western countries. Was there, from your reporting, Tara, a level of optimism that that deal would lead to ultimately Iran perhaps becoming a part of the international community in some fashion?
100%, John. And again, I was there reporting on this. And even the most cynical people, people who don't agree with the government, people who are anti-regime, who want nothing to do with the government, their government, were excited. Because again, they know that the government does whatever they want to do. But if there's if there's an opening, they can benefit from it one way or another. And I'll share a story with you. I actually wrote about this a few weeks ago for the Wilson Center. I compared the apathy and disillusionment that exists right now in Iran versus that of 5 years ago on the days leading up to the JCPOA. And one of the folks I spoke with, he told me, he said, Tara, right after the deal, we managed to find a few companies in the US, Chicago, to do business with. And he's a guy who owns a medical equipment company, private citizen, it's a private company, has nothing to do with the government, young man in his late 30s. And he said, we were so excited, we struck deals with this Chicago-based company. And we were able to do business, and we were starting to build up business and rapport. And then the following year, because of the 2018 unilateral pullout of the deal, they wouldn't even respond to this man's calls. So the US, the Chicago-based company, they would not even communicate with these guys because of sanctions. And that's just one story. And there were so many companies on standby, Renault, French companies, German companies, Swedish companies who were excited to go in, who were investing, and people were excited about, again, ordinary people were excited about that. Even my own uncle, my uncle has had a company in Iran. It has to do with cooling systems of certain factories. Again, private citizen, nothing to do with the government. The company has been around, for almost 40 years. And he works with Germany, and he had to close shop after 30 some years because he couldn't operate anymore. And so there was an enormous amount of enthusiasm back in 2015, 2016, 2017. There were investments going on, but 2018 onward, all bets are off. There's no engagement. And quite frankly, I have to say, I want to add this, John. There was a great piece a few weeks ago in Al Jazeera, is that even though they're not, humanitarian needs or medical, drugs and medical
Right.
supplies are not sanctioned, they are affected because of the sanction on the banking infrastructure. Whereas Iranian companies or private entities can't buy or do business with foreign countries. And an example of this was a Swedish company that provided plasters and bandages for this particular rare skin disorder in Iran. But because they feared the repercussions of these sanctions from the US, they stopped doing business with Iran. Again, they were not directly sanctioned, but they just feared that they're going to be slapped by the US if they were to go to do business with Iran. So they didn't, and there was this really sad human story out of Iran with these folks suffering from these bandages. But yes, there was an enthusiasm back, then, which completely went and gave way to apathy later on.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the news that you touched upon at the beginning of our conversation, and that's the election which took place in the past week. Iran will have soon a new president, Ibrahim Raisi, and we've learned that there seemed to be some great apathy as it relates to the turnout of the vote in Iran. What do you think that is a reflection of, just based upon your conversations that you've had in the course of writing your book? Absolutely.
I think, the low turnout that everyone saw, is a sort of silent protest of everyday Iranians. It's a reflection of the tremendous amount of apathy and disillusionment in their government. They understand that, no matter who the president is, whether it be a reformist, a moderate, or an ultra conservative, as this man is, doesn't really make a difference in their lives. For Iranians, for ordinary Iranians, entertaining this election circus, or as they call it, a circus, is often picking between a bad and a worse. Because again, so many people are tired of this government. They're tired of the system. So for them, it always comes down to, okay, do we pick a more moderate person because we're going to have, less of a stress and things may get better, or at least not worse. That's the quote from one of my last interviews. It's like, we're not really hoping for any real improvements. We just don't want it to get worse, right? But they haven't seen that. And again, I think the equation between, Trump, Rouhani perhaps contributed to that. Had it been another administration, we may have seen at least some opening, perhaps, that people were hoping. And that's, again, according to folks that I've spoken with. But right now, they're so disillusioned, and they understand that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Decisions have been made, and their well-being is really irrelevant, perhaps, to the regime at home, and in ways, policies of the US and the rest of the world toward their country.
We saw last Friday, Tara, during a press conference that the president-elect of Iran had, he was asked a question about whether he'll meet with President Biden if that opportunity presented itself. And he had a one-word answer, no. And so given that there's unlikely to be any type of one-on-one conversation between the leadership of America and the leadership of Iran, do you see things changing in this relationship anytime soon? Do you have a sense of or a glimmer of optimism?
I think for the last 40 years, there hasn't been any direct relations whatsoever, and I think all communications between the United States and Iran has been done through our allies, our U.S. allies, being France and Germany for the most part. So I think they're the brokers in all of this. Even with the ongoing talks in Vienna, you see that they're not even staying at the same hotel. The Americans and the Iranians, and the Germans and the French and the Brits, to an extent, they're shuttling back and forth. So I quite frankly, John, don't read much into that one word answer, that no. To me, that's meaningless, because I do believe that they, meaning the government of Iran, understands that for their own survival, for their own longevity, there has to be a deal, because this can't go on. The country's falling apart. And when I talk to Iranians inside Iran, they are not ready, or they don't have the they don't have the capacity to make another revolution, as we saw, 1979. We're not going to see that. People in America who are waiting to see another revolution in Iran, they're most likely not going to see that anytime soon.
Is that because, let me just interrupt you.
Yeah,
is that because there's fear among the populace of Iran of what the repercussions may be if they tried to overthrow the government that's now in place? Is it because of complacency? Why do you suppose that is?
That it's a very complex issue. Number one, of course, it has to do with the strength of the regime, and the fact that any movement will be choked, as seen, the previous years. We saw in the fall of 2019, in 2018 a little bit, and in 2009 again. People were. It was the first protest of its kind. The Green Movement. They had this sort of semi-reformist leadership that they, out of desperation, clinged onto, because they thought that they can lead their way out of this chaos. And when you spoke with folks in Iran at that time, President Obama was in office, they even wanted him to interfere, and we didn't see that happen. So Iranians always find themselves at this crossroad of not having an international support that serves their interests, the interests of Iranian people, and of course being choked by their own government. Any movement will be stifled very easily. But also, John, I want to add that there is no opposition. The opposition outside, the Iranian opposition outside is not united. They're so disconnected and just far from today's Iran, far from what people want in today's Iran. And inside, there's really no cohesive and concise opposition that can really lead to big change. So it's really a larger conversation that I hope we can have. But I hope I answered in the sort of brief time that we have. But coming back to your previous question about optimism, I do think that this deal is going to go through, the JCPOA. I think for the Iranians, actually very similar to U.S. politics, it kind of comes down to who gets credit for it. And I think they perhaps may want the new administration to come in Iran, and so that they can take credit for the JCPOA or striking a new deal. Who knows? But I do believe that things cannot stay this way. It just can't. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I do hope that things change for the people of Iran and the economy of it especially.
With the people that you spoke to over the course of writing this book, do they have opinions about the leadership of America? Do they have opinions about President Trump and about President Biden? Do they see them essentially as one and the same, regardless of who's leading the United States? What's their view?
This is always a great topic of discussion, John. Iranians, I think, are quite savvy, especially young Iranians. They view U.S. politics as one that only serves U.S. interests. They have learned over the years that the United States is not there to save the world. They look at Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and they're savvy. They do believe. Again, based on my reporting and things, I hear and I'm told, is that U.S. is there to preserve its own interest and not necessarily the interest of the people in those countries. And that's something that they truly believe in. However, this past election, I remember there was a running joke with Iranians inside Iran that we never thought that we'd learn so much about Wisconsin and Wyoming and Florida. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. And that's just because they want things to improve, not go backward, John. And they believe that it has been going backward, and someone perhaps like, a President Biden may not pull things further back, but rather be able to push forward and bring about the change that they so desperately want. And so, yes, they follow US politics so closely, and even with the belief that so much of the United States behavior has to do with its own interests, they think that, some folks in power may perhaps be beneficial in long term for their well-being.
Did the people that you spoke with over the course of the past 4 years during the Trump years, did they feel more isolated? And what I mean by that, Tara, is, as you know, the previous administration really tried to essentially isolate Iran through its policies. The Abraham Accords, for instance, that was an effort to isolate Iran. Trying to re-engage with the Arab countries that surround Israel, that was also an effort to isolate Iran. Were they aware of those efforts? Do they get certain messages filtered to them by the government? Do they get messages that are different from those that come from the government that make them see all of these efforts by the Trump administration in a different way?
number one, I would say, John, that the ordinary people in Iran have this enormous mistrust towards the domestic narrative that comes from, their own government. Nobody watches, the domestic television shows and news. So that distrust exists. So they don't really believe anything that, their government says. However, in tandem, of course, they were so well aware of what the Trump administration is doing. It isolated Iran so much that it choked the country, in the worst possible ways, and sort of adding fuel to this regional fire and this sort of animosity that exists. And I think I'm finding it so interesting that, this last couple of days, the Iranians, the government, has been saying that, we want diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. We would support having embassy. So, that's interesting to see. But one thing that I found quite fascinating said by Iranians that I've spoken with is that, Saudis are very smart. They usually want the United States to fight their war for them. That's something that we saw so closely happen last year, January 2020, with the killing of Soleimani. And, we were so close in a full-blown confrontation between, the United States and Iran, and nobody wants that. I think Iranians, I did an interview with a couple that unfortunately, it didn't make it into the book. Again, all for length reasons, because otherwise it would have been a very thick book that nobody would probably buy. But they are, they're a poor couple that live in a small clinic in downtown Tehran, and do housekeeping and take care of the clinic. The wife cleans, and the husband sort of watches the property because he can't work. He has a mental disability, and he has some physical ailment as well. And I remember in my interview, think about speaking to an incredibly innocent and simple, kind person anywhere in the world. And I said, what do you want for Iran? What do you hope Iran would become? Mm-hmm. He said, all I want is that there's no war. I can't have war. I can't see another war. I can't have young people die to another war. So Iranians are wary of that. They don't want confrontation. They don't want war. They don't want conflict, because inherently they want to belong to an international community, and they have seen the impact of war in their neighborhood.
I'm curious about the people that you spoke with, Tara, if they are aware that the efforts by the government of Iran in pursuing this nuclear weapons program creates a situation which provides perhaps more danger to Iran down the road, maybe doesn't, create a situation where they can feel that peace that you just described. What's their view of that? Is the nuclear weapons program one that ordinary Iranians view with pride, in the same way that we hear that coming from North Koreans, for instance, or is it something that they view with trepidation?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting discussion. I think the views are, there are few views on this topic. Obviously you have sort of the hardliners who, really want to pursue whatever program that is that they think they have the right to. And then there are ordinary citizens, people who, again, look at the neighborhood, look at Israel, look at, Pakistan, and, they're the ones who have the program, and no one, says no to them. And so their argument is that, okay, why can they have it and then we can't? So it's sort of this logic question that they ask independently of the behavior of their government, right? And then those same people, and again, ordinary citizens, they don't care about a nuclear program. They don't care about regional influence or expanding Iran's sphere of, influence. They care about their making ends meet, and care about being able to put food on the table. And so for them, those are key issues. Iranians want to have, a successful, healthy, happy life, and one that they so deserve. And having programs as such is so secondary to them. But fundamentally, I think on a sort of level of logic, they ask, that, why is it that certain countries can have this, but, the United States bullies us in a way, while being in disagreement with the government. John, do you see what I mean? It's nothing to do with the government, yeah. So there are multiple views, yes.
So from their viewpoint, and I'm interested in their viewpoint more so than the leadership of Iran, because that is not going to change, obviously, with the hardliner government that's just been elected. What do they see as necessary in terms of changing the U.S.-Iran dynamic? What is necessary to move it forward?
Oh gosh, I think obviously, the nuclear issue is one that has been going on for years. This is not something that we're only hearing about in the last 6, 7, 8 years. This has been going on for the last 20 plus years, even more. And I would assume that it would continue. But I think perhaps it's time to move on and see Iran through its potential, the potential that the people have, because we saw that sanctions did not bring down this regime, this government, at least quickly so, but only impacted the ordinary lives of the Iranian people that so deserve to live a healthy, prosperous life. And so I fundamentally think that there's an enormous opportunity in the youth, in connecting with the people of Iran, however way that be, and opening ways for commercial and cultural engagement with the people of this country. So in lieu of having diplomatic relations, in lieu of having any interactions between the two governments, why not find ways to have interactions with the people of both sides? So I think, I was always interested in the power of people. I was always interested in the power of diplomacy. It's something that I've covered and delved into in the region. And I do think that, again, in lieu of any diplomatic relations and any short-term possibility of a miracle happening for improvement, the people are worth acknowledging and looking.
Tara, if policymakers in the United States met with some of the people that you write about in your book, what would they learn?
They would learn that Iranians are so similar to their constituencies. Iranians are so similar to folks who make up their communities and their neighborhoods, and even themselves and their families, that their hopes and dreams and aspirations are parallel to that of theirs and the rest of the world. I also feel that they would understand, and I hope that they would understand, that their policies have a direct impact on the livelihoods of ordinary, beautiful people, innocent people who want nothing but growth, prosperity, safety, and security that they unfortunately are not able to meet at home domestically and are not internationally. And John, I wrote the book for my American readers, for an American audience, and I do hope that policymakers read this book, because I feel they don't have a connection to Iran except what they hear on the news and the sound bites and the talking heads and the pressers that they get from the government. They don't have an insight into the heart and soul of this country. And Iran is an incredibly complex society filled with nuance that cannot be reduced to sound bites and rhetorics that are heard constantly. And I think this would give an insight into this 80 million plus society that they're dealing with, and perhaps help them find ways of dealing with Iran whilst having the people in mind as well.
That is such a difficult thing to do, as you know. Yeah, in a perfect world, when we speak of China, for instance, when Americans speak of China, whether you're talking about an average citizen or whether you're talking about a lawmaker, a policymaker, we often speak of China as an adversary. And the same thing can be said for countries like Russia and North Korea, and certainly Iran as well falls into that category. So how do you get beyond that? How do you get beyond calling a country an adversary and yet having some respect for the people of that country and try to speak directly to them and have a message focused directly to them?
I think that's a critical point. 100%. I think it's important to distinguish and differentiate between governments of all these countries that you mentioned and the people. I mean, ordinary Iranians are affected by the policies of the United States. Even on the simplest terms, John. I have a friend, a dear friend of mine. She's a green card holder, and she, a year ago or two, she got a job from one of the U.S. airlines, one of the U.S.-based airlines. And I remember she called me in fear. She said, "Tara, I'm so afraid that they're going to call and revoke the offer because I still have an Iranian passport." But why? Why should a young girl who is as talented as anyone else have this fear that just simply because there's Iran attached to her name or passport, she's not going to be able to get a job? Or why is it that a student who's studying at one of the best universities in the United States on scholarship, who've done everything right to be here, is prevented from going back to see her family because of a blanket travel ban? Right? Or why is it that ordinary people in Iran can't have direct access to certain medicine or be able to buy certain medical equipments in time because of blanket sanctions? So there are ways that policymakers anywhere in the world can have a direct way of showing that, we do care about you people. We do understand your concerns. And I think the more people know about one another, the more ways that they can figure out creatively to deal with situations as such. And I think, the narrative on Iranians inside the United States is incredibly insular and is reduced to, like I said earlier, nuclear talks, sanctions, angry government officials, and, the hostage crisis. All the movies, John, on Iran. Give me one movie that talks about Iran's culture and, not necessarily the hostage crisis or the nuclear program. There's none.
Well, that's exactly right, in the sense that that is the American view of Iran, and it is based upon what we see sometimes on our network news or coming out of Hollywood. You're right about that. That's why I think that there's so much to be gained from your book. As far as the sanctions that you've mentioned, and you mentioned a few of them, including the travel ban, with the people that you spoke to, is there an animus that you detect towards the United States because of those sanctions? Is there an understanding about why those sanctions have been put in place in the first place?
Oh, for sure. They definitely understand why the United States sanctions Iran. It's, obviously because of the behavior of the government. They understand, but they also are aware that the sanctions don't affect the government at all in ways. It has, again, made them stronger. Mind you that the conservatives in Iran got further emboldened because of the maximum pressure, and they managed to sideline, all the moderate voices and sort of, took gain of the government. And so, yes, people are 100% aware, but at the same time, they also know that it's not working and it's only hurting them and affecting ordinary people. I think anywhere in the world, John, bad actors find their way to continue whatever they're doing. And sanctions are a way for other governments and countries to perhaps feel good about themselves and say, oh, we're doing something. And, at points, some may work, but fundamentally at its core, at least in short term, it affects the civil society, and it has done to Iran.
We don't have much time left, Tara, and I want to return to one of the things that came about in your book, and that's just seeking out these interviews in the first place. Did you convey to them the idea that through their stories, you hope to make a difference in some small way in the way that America, Americans, policymakers, lawmakers view their country?
My mission, John, with the book and what I convey to the people is that I want to tell the stories of ordinary Iranians, stories that are not told and are not heard, and stories that are independent from whatever political agenda there is. There is no agenda here. I took 4 years off from work, working to do this book. It's an incredibly independent project that I did just because I do value the power of storytelling and the power of human beings. There's a beautiful quote by one of my favorite authors, Kazuo Ishiguro. He wrote in his Nobel speech when he was winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said, there are incredibly lucrative and fancy industries around storytelling, movies, theater, music, even books. But fundamentally, storytelling and stories are about one person telling another, this is how I feel. Do you feel that too? This is what I see. Do you see that? And I think there's so much to be gained when Americans understand and see how Iranians feel, see things, view things, and what they have to say. And that's for the benefit of people in both countries.
I would imagine you have such a connection with these 24 individuals that you profile in your book. Are they aware of the finished product? Have they seen the finished product?
Well, the book just came out. The book just came out last month, and I only got my copies last month. But they see the sort of news reports, the coverage, so they're excited, and I'm definitely gonna send some books through some friends who travel to Iran to these people. And there's no Amazon and there's none of that in Iran. Again, this book is published in the US for American readers. Of course, it's available Europe, Canada, but you know what I mean. But no, they're excited, and I'm getting so many sort of thank you notes from Iranians, some in Iran, but some also in the United States, saying thank you for talking about the people, for differentiating between the people and the government, because that's really the intention. That, again, like I said earlier, Iran is made up of 80 million human beings, not 80 million, centrifuges.
Well, you did an excellent job in explaining that throughout the book and through these individuals, through their stories. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Tara, and I do hope other people that are watching this get an opportunity to read your book, because you can learn so much about individuals by just, reading a little bit about their daily lives, their humanity, and you have a different picture of a country when you do that. And if that was your goal, I think you've met your goal, Tara. So congratulations to you, and I wish you much success as you continue promoting this book, because it's a wonderful piece of journalism. So thank you very much. It was great to do this with you today for the McCain Institute.
Thank you, John. It was such a pleasure speaking with you, and many thanks to the McCain Institute for hosting this fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our discussion. And as Tara said, go to Amazon.com if you're obviously more curious about our discussion and Tara's book. Hold it up one more time, Tara, so they get an opportunity to see it.
Of course, and local booksellers as well. You know, John, if they want to support their local bookstore, please do. It's available pretty much everywhere, but easily and readily on Amazon.
Excellent. Great job. Best of luck to you, Tara, and I hope to talk to you real soon.
Absolutely. Thanks much.
Bye. Thank you.